I used to hate open world games. Or at least I used to hate what happened to a game when it had an open world. I saw Metal Gear Solid 5 ruin the tight, stealth-driven gameplay of previous MGS games. Arguably, that wasn't entirely the fault of the open world, but it certainly contributed, and it's one of the few games that I've started that I'll never finish out of disappointment. Fallouts 3 and 4 both seemed like the kind of game I'd be into, but were both ultimately disappointing. The little I played of the Grand Theft Auto series at a friend's house felt, perhaps ironically, more mechanically restrictive for the open world than the more linear experiences I preferred. In games that promised the world, they largely only delivered if you're interested in punching, shooting or driving it, while the more linear takes on the same ideas offered those same interactions without the lost opportunities and broken promises of the open world. Admittedly, all of those issues were exacerbated by personal preference. In general, I tend to prefer a narrative-driven experience in games. But then I played Mirror's Edge Catalyst, an open-world sequel to a game I loved that had a terribly weak narrative, and was still disappointed by a game that simply didn't use the open world to its advantage. Somehow, despite all of this, I was still excited to play The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. I bought a Switch specifically for it, and despite usually being very considered in my purchasing decisions, I'm not sure I can entirely explain why I did so. Sure, the trailers looked great, the art style was stunning, and it was a Zelda title, but I, at that point, hadn't yet played a single open world game that I really loved, let alone one worth the price of a console. Despite this, I was excited for reasons I can't properly explain, and that excitement should have been another warning sign. When a game's hyped up, I rarely find it lives up to its reputation. With people spewing Game of the Year and perfect scores, even at its release, how could Breath of the Wild possibly live up to my expectations? Half-Life 2, while a great game, didn't reach the expectations others, and the original, instilled in me. The aforementioned Fallout 3 seems competent enough, but hardly the masterpiece some claimed it to be, and Metal Gear Solid 5 didn't only fail to meet my expectations, it left me seriously questioning my love for the earlier games, given so many critics at its release praised it as the very best of the series. So going into Breath of the Wild, I should have been disappointed. The game lacked the traditional dungeons of its predecessors. There wasn't much in the way of variety in the enemies you faced, and its world was huge. On that last point, I need to qualify what I mean. After all, the size of a game's world is often touted as a feature. But for me, big, huge, open worlds have always been a bit of a red flag. Because in trying to make a world large, the developers invariably make sacrifices in its density. In Fallout 4, for example, great, we have this town and that city and this vault, etc., but between each is a lot of nothing. It's not really a bad thing, mind you. It can add to the world building, to the feel of a particular fictional universe, to find yourself trudging through the miles that separate points A and B. But generally speaking, I'd rather have a tightly paced, short experience than a lengthy but slower paced one. At this point, you may notice I've been using generally and usually as qualifiers to most of my statements thus far, and you've probably guessed the reason. Breath of the Wild carries with it all of those features that I typically have problems with, but where in other games they've acted as frustrations, in Breath of the Wild they are the source of the great joy I've had while playing it. To discuss these areas of the game's design, and the reason I enjoyed them in Breath of the Wild and not other games, I'm going to break this next part of the video up into 5 different segments. Bear in mind they all overlap with the others, but I break them up as it makes it easier to discuss and to digest on your end. Breath of the Wild feels bigger than any other open world game I've come across. In talking about that feeling, I've got to discuss a bunch of different factors that all contribute but don't really fit neatly into a more traditional category, so bear with me a little here. In my previous experiences, big has never been a good thing. There may be hundreds of locations, thousands of enemies, and millions of collectibles, but rarely do any of those individual elements feel satisfying by themselves. Not so in Breath of the Wild. A sense of scale is first delivered by the stunningly rendered vistas, and perhaps more significantly the subtly brilliant sound design. As you stand in a field of grass, you can hear the wind rush through it. The sound Link makes as he runs changes with the gear he has equipped. and sounds of rain or thunder have a physicality to them I've never experienced in a game before. To the point that upon hearing thunder in-game while wearing headphones, I actually looked outside to check that it wasn't in fact the real thing I'd just heard. Turning my head back to the Switch in my hands, I saw a tree struck by lightning fall to the ground. The hair on my neck stood on end. In the small details, you see a reflection of the whole of the game world. Each element, while small in nature, contributes to a game that feels truly big without any of the sacrifices I typically associate with such a world. Subtle visual details, like the tracks you leave in the sand and the way the shadows move throughout the day, all sell you on an experience that feels so genuine that, although visually and physically there's a dramatic difference, I could demonstrate the experience of playing it through videos I've taken in real life. Of course, they aren't the same, but no video game I've come across has come this close before. Although not strictly a problem with open world design, a game's combat is an area I find a lot of open world games to be lacking in. But thankfully, the combat in Breath of the Wild feels just as fleshed out as its landscapes. Just as you can defeat most enemies with any weapon if you're skilled enough, so too can almost any enemy kill you if you aren't paying attention. Death is simultaneously easy to avoid and quick to arrive, so the combat always keeps you on your toes. On top of that, there's a lot to learn. Spears, swords, two-handed weapons, they all feel significantly different and require different approaches in combat. Approaches you're forced to experiment with because almost every weapon will break pretty quickly. You're constantly forced to try new tactics, and the result is a combat experience that feels fresh every time, and the exact opposite of the disappointing combat in the likes of Mirror's Edge Catalyst. One of my favourite aspects of Breath of the Wild is the one I've seen receive the most criticism. Amazing game, shame about the OST, seems a popular line of thought in discussions online. I couldn't disagree more. While it does lack the rousing melodies one might remember from the likes of Ocarina of Time, it does have echoes of them, and the quiet, sparse music serves to put emphasis on the wonderful sound design, which, again, is perhaps even more important to me than the wonderful art style in painting an image of the world. The quiet nature of the soundtrack serves to enhance the excitement of the major moments, while allowing a good amount of space to breathe in between. This is the part where I typically quiet down and let you judge for yourself, but from the experiences of others covering this game, I can't really do as much without seeing this video demonetized. So instead I'll link you via the card above to a short clip from the game featuring one of my favourite pieces of its music. Feel free to pause this video and come back once it's done. Breath of the Wild has pretty average characters compared to a more narrative-focused game, but it makes a few important decisions that flesh out its characters in a wonderful way. Although certain characters remain largely in the one place, others travel the very same roads you find yourself on, and every now and again a character may ask you if you've seen their friend or partner. The result is an extended cast that feel as though they have a genuine purpose, that have jobs and relationships, fears and desires. As characters, they all remain fairly simplistic. You won't find any characters that will truly stand out as special, but every character does stand out from those around them. It's not that Nintendo did anything special or surprising here, just that they've done what needs to be done to build a convincing world. So why mention this as the penultimate point in this list? Shouldn't merely competent characterization fall far behind the sort of praise I'm offering in the other segments? Well, in just about every other game, especially those that only recently transitioned into an open world design, something is typically sacrificed. In a game where almost every aspect has a nearly mind-blowing scope, I could forgive the bugs of Bethesda games, or the occasional dull location, or characters that seem to lack place or reason within that world. But no. Here, every character is named, has a story, has a life. Nintendo refused to compromise the quality of their work to jam in an open world, and the result is the first open world that I've truly loved exploring. Finally, we come to the density of Breath of the Wild. Earlier I described my issues with a world that holds interest in points A and B, but little in between. And on the surface, it looks like that issue of density may still be the case here. For the most part, it appears to be much the same, points A and B still hold the majority of the interest, while the space in between them holds less. True. There are, however, a lot of small differences that all add up to a brilliant experience travelling between points A and B, instead of the rather dull one offered in many other games. The most obvious difference simply lies in the beautiful visuals and excellent sound design. While, for example, I can recognise many elements of Fallout 3 top those of Fallout 4, I enjoy my time in Fallout 4 more simply for the fact the world is rendered in more than just greens and browns. It stands to reason then that if I adore how Hyrule has been brought to life in Breath of the Wild, I'm going to find it more enjoyable as a whole. There is some truly stunning scenery here, scenery that's as much a reward as any other element of the game. The next change, or changes, are found in these little guys, Korok seeds. Yes, just another collectible in a sense, but it's the way they're implemented that makes all the difference. If you come across some curious aspect in the environment, it's almost always a Korok seed that you need to obtain by solving a small puzzle or hitting a few targets in a row with your bow. So while you still have changes in the density of Hyrule, you never feel like you lack an objective. And if it's not a Korok seed, it's a shrine, offering a more significant puzzle and subsequent reward. Exploration is always enjoyable, whether you know where you're going or not, and often you don't. You aren't simply granted a map before you begin to explore. In order to get a map of a particular area, you need to climb a Sheikah Tower. Towers which typically lie at the heart of an area and offer their own unique challenges in order to reach the top. It forces you to make something of a mental map as you go, and after you reach the top of a Sheikah Tower, you're rewarded not only with the map, but also an image of just how far you've come, a distance you often don't notice while you're travelling it. A lovely touch worth mentioning here is that Hyrule is quite mountainous. Peaks and valleys ensure you can only set your sights on a nearby goal, and you never face any time-sensitive narrative pressures, so you're free to explore strings of smaller goals as much as you want. You never end up frustrated by a goal that's a long way off, that takes a long way to get to. The overall effect of these decisions, particularly that of gaining maps by completing minor puzzles or challenges in climbing the Sheikah Towers, is that although the traditional dungeons of the Zelda series aren't really present anymore, the whole of Hyrule now feels like one giant dungeon. Travelling from points A to B feel much the same as travelling between the rooms of a single dungeon in the earlier titles. Each new room and each new vista offering exciting possibilities and fascinating challenges. The density of its world still changes, but as the gameplay alters with those changes, the slower moments often bring just as much joy, if not more, than those larger moments, because while the areas may differ in density, the care that has been put into them is consistent. Breath of the Wild is truly brilliant stuff on so many levels, including many that I haven't even touched upon. And between the Sheikah Towers and the shrines, Link's new ability to climb almost any surface, and his wonderful hang glider, Breath of the Wild manages to remain both surprising and consistently exciting in every moment. And so, I have to conclude that I didn't hate open world games. I just hadn't yet played one where its reality matched its promise, where the scope of its ambition was matched by its execution, where the Breath of the Wild raised the hairs on the back of my neck. So I guess it's pretty obvious I'm a little in awe of Breath of the Wild, but that doesn't mean I can't see why some have issues with it. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Does it break too far from the rest of the series, or does it bring a breath of fresh air to a beloved franchise? I look forward to reading your thoughts in the comments below. Cheers, have a good one.